Hey everybody, welcome to Improv FAQ. I'm James Quesada, and in this episode we're going to talk about a question that I get all the time, especially from people who are taking their first improv class. So, are there like books that I can read about improv that'll help me get better at it? So, in this video we're going to talk about improv books and other resources that can help you learn more about improv. We'll cover recommended reading and media, including books and podcasts, as well as some other miscellaneous resources. Let's start with books. There are actually a ton of books on improv. There used to be like 4 books on improv, and now there's like 4,000. And as a disclaimer, I have not read every improv book ever written, but I have read a lot of them. So I want to make 2 different types of recommendations. I want to make a recommendation for beginners or people just starting out, and then another one for the more intermediate or advanced improviser. So if you're just starting out, the best book I can recommend for you is The Second City, Almanac of Improvisation by Libera. The Second City is a sketch theater that is based out of Chicago, and it uses improv to develop written shows, and it's also one of the most important landmarks of modern comedy and entertainment. This book does an excellent job framing the world of improv. It provides both historical and modern context for improv comedy, and it also makes really clear insights on the Second City approach to improv while making respectful statements about schools of thought outside of the Second City. As you can see, there are a couple dozen different contributors to this book, including Tina Fey, Keegan-Michael Key, Susan Messing, and Fred Willard. And this makes it really accessible because it reads like a collection of essays, so you can make your way through it pretty easily. It also means you're getting a diverse set of perspectives and opinions on improv philosophy, and I think that's what really sets this book apart from all others, is how inclusive it is of different approaches to improv and uses for improv. The main author, Libera, is an excellent guide through these different voices and philosophies, and she really shines a light on just how many different ways there are to think about improv, and that there's no one right way to succeed. That, to me, is an invaluable thing to offer, and really, I just can't recommend this book enough. It's just really, really well done. Doesn't matter where you're taking classes or what your experience level is, this book is an awesome resource, but particularly for those who are just starting out and wanting to get the best, most complete scope of things from a single book. So I want to make a couple honorable mentions for books that are also great for beginners or people just starting out in improv, one of which is Truth in Comedy. This is the original handbook of the I.O. Theater in Chicago, and that's the birthplace of modern longform. This is a book that a lot of improvisers have read, which makes it a great common denominator and a great place to start as well. Improvise by Mick Napier of the Annoyance Theater, also in Chicago, is a great read. This book takes a pretty much polar opposite perspective on things to Truth in Comedy. So this is a great read by itself. It's also a great back-to-back read with Truth in Comedy, if that's the route that you choose to go. If you are an intermediate or advanced improviser, meaning that you've been improvising for more than a year and or you've completed a program at an improv theater, or you're doing shows on at least a semi-regular basis, my recommendation is going to be to read Behind the Scenes by Mick Napier. If every improviser read this book today, by tomorrow there would be half as many bad shows and twice as many good ones. And the whole book is really aimed at conquering the most common hurdles that improvisers face as individuals, as teams, as theaters, and even as whole improv communities. This book starts with Mick Napier sharing his thoughts on how improvisers think about and treat long-form improv and how much pressure we put on ourselves to play and to have fun. He also shares why he thinks this is the case and offers some really great insights on the psychology of taking play too seriously and the balance between playing freely and performing successfully. This book has whole chapters dedicated to things like editing a long-form show, why in long-form we take suggestions from the audience, and how to use the suggestion without beating it to death. It also has a chapter on the variety of scene styles and energies in a long-form show and how to track those and keep things dynamic as the show goes on. And maybe even the most important thing in this book is a chapter on introducing long-form shows and how we might be able to do a better job inviting our audiences into the experience of a long-form improv show. He points out that even though improv is spreading like wildfire and there's theaters and festivals popping up all over the country, mainstream audiences still don't really know what improv is and what they're getting themselves into, especially when it comes to long-form improv. And even amongst ourselves, we have a hard time defining as improvisers what it is that we're doing. And Mick Napier offers Really, really helpful guidance on both of those things. So read it. So I'll also do some honorable mentions for books that are also great for intermediate to advanced improvisers, including How to Be the Greatest Improviser on Earth by Will Hines. This book is probably the most practical, straightforward book to read if you're just looking for like useful tips that you can pick up and implement the next time you get on stage. This is a really great one to read through. There's also Improvisation at the Speed of Life by TJ and Dave with Pam Victor. If you are interested in creating really grounded, nuanced comedy with your improv, that is absolutely what these guys do, and this book is really the whole philosophy on making it happen. Another one is The Comic Toolbox by John Vorhaus. If you're looking for a refreshing perspective, less under the umbrella of improv and performing and acting, this one is under the umbrella of comedy and offers some really great principles on what makes comedy work, what makes things funny, and how to use those principles to create your own comedy. Okay, so now let's talk about improv podcasts. And again, I'm going to break this into two categories because if you're looking for improv podcasts, chances are you're looking for either improv insights, more that interview format where you can kind of hear people talk shop about improv and hear about improvisers' approach to things and stories from their lives and all that. Or you're looking for improv entertainment, shows that are funny to listen to and use improv as a performance method in the medium of podcasts. If you're looking for improv insights out of your podcast, the best place to start is Improv Nerd with Jimmy Carrane. Jimmy Carrane is an old school improviser from the late 80s, early 90s wave of Chicago improvisers, and he has had just about every respected, successful, beloved improviser that you can think of on his show. He sits down with them and talks about their entry into the improv world, their story of how they went from getting started with improv to wherever it is they are today in the world of comedy. And then they also do a short set on pretty much every episode where they actually perform 10 minutes of improv. And then afterward, they talk about how it went, how it felt, and then they do a live Q&A with the audience. So really, it's the did it first, did it best interview improv podcast. And I would just recommend going through the long list of, 300 episodes that he's on now. Look for a name that you recognize and just start there. Honorable mentions for insight podcasts in improv. Number one would be Improv Obsession with Stephen Perlstein. That one's really interesting. It's also an interview-based podcast, but Stephen goes from, in the very beginning, being an enthusiastic student of improv and interviewing his guests from that perspective, all the way to the end of his podcast series, where I think like the last episode that he posts is him like quitting improv and being fed up with it. So it's a really interesting arc to kind of follow him through that journey on his show. There's also UCB Longform Conversations. That is a UCB podcast, obviously. I think it's actually independent of the theater itself, but all of the conversations had on it are with improvisers that are performing regularly on house teams or in the UCB communities of New York and LA. And so it's a really direct look into the world of people who are doing this for real right now. And then the last one is one of my favorite podcasts, period, which is Off Camera with Sam Jones. Not every guest on this podcast is an improviser, but there are a lot of celebrity-type improvisers that are interviewed by Sam, including Keegan-Michael Key and Jason Sudeikis, Lauren Lapkus. And over the course of an episode with Sam Jones, he's a great conversationalist, asks all the right questions, and really gets the nitty-gritty out of his guests. So if you see an episode that intrigues you on his list of guests, check that out, because I guarantee you'll get sucked into it and fall in love with Sam Jones. I love you. If you're looking for podcasts that use improv as entertainment, best recommendation I can give is Improv for Humans. This is Matt Besser's podcast, who's one of the founding members of the UCB, and he sits down with a panel of guests that are all incredibly funny people, some of the funniest in both the on-camera TV and film world, as well as practicing improvisers on the UCB stages. And they have conversations as real people, and then from there they do scenes meant to be listened to using improv, just the way that they would do in a live theater setting at the theaters, but just in the podcast medium. And it's one of the funniest shows around. So check that one out if what you're into is improv as entertainment in a podcast. Honorable mentions for entertainment improv podcasts. Number one would be Spontaneanation with Paul F. Tompkins. That one's coming up on 200 episodes. And I guess he's going to stop after that, so he's going to Seinfeld it. And that means that it has to be good. Number two is Hello from the Magic Tavern, which is super interesting. It's very, very funny. It's a fantasy narrative podcast where they maintain all the things that they create in their improv in each episode carries over episode to episode. So they're building the world as they go, even though it's still all improvised. There's also Off Book, which is a musical improv show. Super impressive, super entertaining to listen to. And the last one is a shout out to Detroit improviser Adam Peacock, who has a show called My Neighbors Are Dead, where they do improvised spin-offs featuring minor characters of horror movies. And that one is also super entertaining, super fun to listen to. Awesome concept. And that's it for honorable mentions. Beyond books and podcasts, let's talk about some other media resources. Number one would be Pam Victor's Geeking Out With. This is another interview series, but Pam Victor does a really nice job of zeroing in on the improvisers, the people who are actively performing and coaching and directing in the improv world, the living legends of today's improv community. And this is really highly consumable content because it's a transcribed interview. So the interviews you can read in like 10 to 15 minutes on a lunch break or in your downtime. So I recommend that one for sure. There's also the Improv IRC Wiki. IRC stands for Improv Resource Center. And so the Wiki has a bunch of terms and forms and games and people of interest that are laid out in a kind of database or archive. And so that's a rabbit hole that is definitely worth going down if you're just kind of curious what exists out there in the trivium of improv. There's also a great blog called Improv Nonsense, which is also by Will Hines, the author of How to Be the Greatest Improviser on Earth. He started his improv writings in that blog, and they still exist out on the web today. A lot of that stuff went into his book, but if you're more of a web browser, that's a really great resource that still exists from Will Hines. Last one is going to be another TJ and Dave recommendation. TJ and Dave, if you don't know, are an improv duo that had a long-standing show at the I.O. in Chicago, and that show came to an end. They did their last one. I'm sure they'll still perform around here and there, but their regular show that used to play on Wednesday nights in Chicago isn't a regular show anymore. But they still have a Vimeo catalog of tapes of their show that are accessible and really a great watch if you're, again, trying to look into that world of like really nuanced, realistic, grounded improv. Watch that catalog of shows. It's really, really valuable. And there's also a documentary about their show called Trust Us, This Is All Made Up. So take a look at their catalog and or that documentary, and those are really great insights in a video format for you. Okay, so that does it for my recommendations on improv books and podcasts and other resources and media. Hopefully you found something in there that piqued your interest and you can go hunt down and look into and study up on your improv. I gotta say, more than anything I've recommended in this video, I recommend going out and doing improv, either in a class or on a stage, because that is ultimately the best way to learn about improv. Go be the improv that you have questions about.